Hello, this is the first in a series of strange creature presentations. And I'm Al Fry, and in the next couple of hours, we're going to explore some of the larger life forms that are still considered monsters and legends on this unique planet of ours. Now, please bear with us if the quality of illustrations isn't high enough for great detail. It's just a subject that doesn't get enough exposure for visual documentation. Now, the scientific community will often scoff at the idea of these creatures being in existence yet. But Mother Nature has billions of eggs of strange life forms scattered over Mother Earth and her skin. And when the right conditions come along, the right eggs will hatch out a suitable life form. Now, in 1900, an amateur scientist named Andrew Cross startled the scientific world by announcing he had produced life from rocks. By electrifying porous stone and submerging it in sulfuric acid and silicitate of potash solutions, a small insect was formed in the rock. Now, scientists of then and now scoffed at the experiments, even though others got the same results through the same actions. So what Cross had actually done then was to hatch out minute insect eggs, which were supported in the rock. And our Earth supports uncountable forms of life hidden away in such eggs that are only hatched when suitable conditions arise. Now, just as humankind was made up of all sizes of our species in the past, so too animals often had extreme size differences at various times in the past, and many small skeletons of strange small creatures are frequently dug up or seen in the records of rock impressions. Well, as the climate and nature of Earth changed drastically some 13,000 years ago, what remained of the extremely large and small monsters of the Earth died out for the most part. The spirit matter or antimatter part of these animals had to come back into smaller present species that we recognize today, the giant reptile families of yesterday, or today then the small lizards and such that we see scattered across the globe. And further details of why the climate suddenly changed on this Earth is covered elsewhere. In 1922 Scientific American, it mentions a report of many of these mammoth reptiles still being seen down in South America in the plateau regions, which we see here. Now, even the Indians in our own country tell about their forefathers who built stockades to keep these giant beasts like this at bay. Now, we all know that there were many different varieties of interesting dinosaurs on the planet millions of years ago. A few people realize that many different varieties have been reported in recent years. And, for instance, dinosaurs have been reported in Africa for at least 2 centuries. Now, in 1776, there were reports expedition in Africa which told of these huge vegetation gobblers, and the stories have never ceased since then. In the early 80s, for example, a couple of United States expeditions went looking for the beasts, and one actually saw the animals. Now, some of these prehistoric animals, like the Brontosaurus and Stegosaurus, shown here, were huge. North of the Great Pyramid, an ancient day and night boat used by the pharaohs in ceremonial rites was found, and it's actually the head of a gigantic animal with huge teeth, even larger than these prehistoric animals shown here. Now, there was a mummy of this particular species of duck-billed dinosaur that was found in Wyoming some years ago. It was acquired by the American Museum of New York. And this, of course, proved that this species was millions of years past the extinction date set by experts. Now, there are isolated incidents of creatures like this being with us today. And explorer-writer Harold Wilkins tells of a French traveler and a priest in the Yukon Territory who saw an Arctic dinosaur in 1905. It was roughly 100 miles east of Dawson. They saw giant tracks, and within a day of pursuing their quarry, they saw it. It was 50 foot long. It was thought to weigh about 50 tons. And unlike its southern brethren, it had stiff, bristly hair and a horn protruding from its head. And 5 years later, the same media told of another sighting of the beast on Partridge Creek near Dawson. Now, water monsters up to 100 feet have long been described by natives around the headwaters of the Nile in country like this. Well, there are several African lakes that have huge lake monsters which have been seen by numerous natives and explorers. And these Congo monsters, which are called Mokele Mobembe by the natives, have been seen from the 18th century and are still sighted today. Now, unlike the aggressive meat hunters, which we have an example here, these shy African vegetation eaters have snake-like heads and long tails and can reach up to 50 feet. And they're similar to dinosaurs. The dinosaurs that we see illustrations of so often. Now, according to German press reports, the photos they showed of a swamp monster in the Congo was taken by a Swedish rubber plantation overseer in the area of Kasai. He'd seen a strange beast with a reptile head and tail while in the swamps and snapped its picture. The zoologists of the time were skeptical of the claims, of course. Well, in 1983, one skeptic was the head zoologist of the Congo, and he decided after 2 centuries of rumors to investigate the river monsters of the Congo himself. And imagine his surprise when he located one in the Lake Tell region. It was unfortunately in deep water. It didn't cooperate by coming ashore and having its picture taken, but it was seen in the deeper water, and this was in Fate magazine of 1281. In the 70s, of course, the movies got in on the act and showed classic examples of the great reptiles fighting among each other, and this is an example of the animator's art here. Well, evidently, in the African nation, the gigantic water monsters aren't the only unusual prehistoric monsters that are living there. And in Upper Kenya, even the bravest Maasai warriors will not venture into one area where the Nandi bears live. Explorers looking for them have come up missing. They are said to be huge and have a head somewhat like a lion, and they jump on victims from trees. Very little evidence, of course, is available to show that this is a reality. What we do have a little more proof of are the mammoths and mastodons in our recent past. And it's assumed that most of our ancestors had to deal with these mammoths and mastodons, and even Indians in Canada say their recent ancestors built houses on stilts in the northern lakes there to escape these great beasts with tusks that roam through that part of the country. And Indians in our eastern United States say they built stockades for similar reasons. And all this is in their traditions and legends. The same story, of course, is written on the cave walls all over the planet. And Picture Rock in Pennsylvania in 1872 shows a fight between a mammoth and Indians. And this Lenape stone shows wigwams and warriors. And other cave writings found across the globe show mammoths and prove the point. According to an 1873 zoologist journal, a New York reporter interviewed a Russian who had seen 5 mammoths in a remote valley at the headwaters of the Lena River. Now, none were young, and he assumed that the tiny group may die off without replacement stock. Now, in the same year of 1873, the Scientific American told of Russian colonists who found 3 living mastodons in northern Siberia. Now, a few earlier in 1827, John Rankin wrote of mastodons still living down in South America in the Andes. We all hear of the trapper legends in the northern part of Canada, of course, telling of these signs in an earlier era. Many of these early North American trappers and such cut steaks for frozen mastodons and mammoths and ate them from the frozen creatures that were frozen for goodness knows how long in the ice there. The Indian traditions in the same area tell of caribou and elk that were once gigantic, but evidence is lacking in this. There have been no frozen carcasses to prove the theory, and they may have referred to the mastodons. Well, what we do know is that both mammoths and elephants, the ancient varieties, are described in various North American Indian legends and the legends of people all over the planet in the northern areas. And some of the scientific monthlies, for instance, cover such stories and legends and sightings, actually. 1952 Scientific Monthly is a good example. Considerable evidence points to the fact that while these great beasts were roaming the face of the planet, our relatives and forebears were right there among them. And what about the sea monsters of the world? Whole books could be written on the subject. Hundreds of sightings and ship logs all across the globe, hundreds of years now. Even in today's tabloid newsstand magazines and tabloids, there are still cases of sea monsters being sighted. Now, a recent example was the 4,000-pound carcass that a Japanese found off the coast of New Zealand. Well, this fisherman named Maru photographed and took samples of this monster in 1977. And tests showed that the animal was not a mammal. Well, even when such monsters wash up on shore or get caught dead in nets, the majority of scientists still scoff at the evidence. And they think up their alternative scenarios. Such monsters are supposed to be extinct, and they're extinct in the textbooks, and so they're extinct. Here's a 1951 photograph of the Henday carcass. This is the Quirkville remains that washed up on the shore in 1934, about 23 feet or so long. You'll notice the individual is standing to the right there. And all of this, of course, is horse feathers. There are explanations for this, besides there being monsters. Well, even with rampant skepticism, many of the scientific journals run accounts of these monsters, A detailed account of a run-in by Norwegians with a 50-foot sea serpent was in an early zoological issue of 1847. One of the men angered it by shooting it, and they just barely escaped to shore in a small boat. And the next year, there were other sightings and another shooting scene in a larger ship like this, which brought the attention of a 130-foot monster to the ship crew in question here. Well, one of these zoologist articles brought on response from crew members who'd seen sea monsters and explained that their officers would not record the incidents for obvious reasons. Well, some of the ancients were not quite so close-minded. The Romans, for example, had a number of monster subjects shown up in their mosaics, like this one. This one is from about the 2nd century A.D. It's called the Beasts of Nodens. The ancient mariners called the giant squids the krakens. In 1861, the French vessel Corvette battled with one of these giant squids, and the squid took many cannonballs and harpoons with very little effect. And it was one of several early encounters with these huge squids. Now, typically, shore authorities put it on the books as a mass hallucination. Actually, there are more sightings inland than there are at sea. There are several sea serpents around Chesapeake Bay, for example. It's on the Potomac River, and they've been sighted off and on over the years, and residents say that they're 30 to 40 feet long. In April 1983, one was actually videotaped, according to Fate magazine of 483. Lake Champlain has a similar monster that's protected by Vermont laws, passed in 1982. It's been about 50 foot long, according to reports, and has his neck as thick as an oil drum. It's been seen off and on for many years, according to the observers there and residents. Well, the submerged bodies of these monsters is tremendous in comparison to the little necks, which are most frequently seen. This is an actual photo of one. It was taken in April '83. And as we mentioned, Robert Frew videotaped one of the monsters with his family. And the Smithsonian scientists simply conceded that the tape seemed authentic, but the life form was not identifiable. This is in May 31, 1982. Well, many North American lakes have monsters and serpents of other types in them. There have been hundreds of sightings. Typical was a 70-foot long snake-like creature sighted and later filmed as it swam under a boat of the filmer, and it was at Okanagan Lake in British Columbia. It was described in a November '78 Smithsonian magazine. But like the plesiosaurs that we spoke of earlier in the Belgian Congo and the inland river lakes of Africa, most of the American varieties and the North American varieties of lake monsters are tame, and relatively few have ever upset boats or fishermen or harmed human beings. Well, today, even scientists are now having to give up their skepticism about tales of giant eels living in the ocean. A Danish biologist dredged up a 6-foot eel larva from the sea, which meant the mother of this larva had to be around 100 feet long. And that, my friends, is a long eel. For hundreds of years, monsters have been bending deep sea hooks up to several feet long. And only lately have we been scanning the ocean with various devices down deep where these monsters live. And of course, eyewitnesses have been seeing these monsters for centuries, except there have been no evidences. Well, today such evidence is accumulating. Now, the Deepster is a vessel owned by Westinghouse that was exploring the ocean at 6,000 feet in the San Diego Trough, and suddenly a monster fish confronted it with eyes as big as dinner plates. And there were 2 sightings of this 30-foot monster in the early 80s. And what else is lurking at the depth is just hard to speculate on at this point. Well, giant land snakes have long been spoken of by natives and explorers in the Latin areas and jungle areas of Africa, and some of them have eaten livestock and humans, if reports are correct. A huge specimen was supposedly photographed by one Belgian military aviator. It was detailed in a 1969 Pursuit magazine. In the early 60s, Italian researchers Falchi actually photographed an anaconda that was around 120 feet and weighed a full ton. And it had just eaten 2 calves for lunch, according to the Venezuelan Daily Journal. Well, while the large snakes and water monsters are fairly numerous over the face of the globe, there's one incredible species of ground monster that is truly rare, and it's the huge worms. And in 1878, Nature magazine, there was an article told of giant worms in the highland of certain southern provinces of Brazil. And this Minhacoa has been seen on numerous occasions, and its burrowing trenches were not unusual in the region. And they frequently start burrowing from marshes during the rainy season and excavate inland. Now, their head has a snout somewhat like a pig, and the bodies are armed like the scales of an armadillo of one species, only they're large enough to uproot young trees. An 1878 Nature magazine told of similar underground monsters in Central America. In 1929, an earthworm longer than a man was found, according to collected data by Wilkins, and its eggs were 3 inches long and a greenish translucent color. And of course, in the mines of the world, there are occasionally found a type of armored worm that has a small, tiny body, but it lives hundreds of feet below the surface. And an 1881 Scientific American has an article on this. And other worms are unusual too, and small black snow worms have been described at very high altitudes by many climbers and explorers over the years. Well, in the same areas of the world where the giant monsters and worms and snakes live, there are, of course, the gorillas. And in an early biological journal, a naturalist named Bleckenow told of a giant gorilla killing one of his companions, and it was the head of the Rio Mopan in Yucatan. It lived in a cave that the naturalist actually found, but he could find no Indian to aid him, and he had to return to civilization without this monster. Now, a few years later in the same area, Mayan women were sometimes molested and scared by a gigantic gorilla creature. And in this illustration, it's a little overdone as to size, but there does exist many records of such encounters. Harold Wilkins tells of a true King Kong who attacked and killed a number of cattle near Aldeas on the Rio Araguaina in 1937. It was estimated to be about 12 foot high, and in a few nights of raids, the whole village deserted the area. Well, Spanish records tell of children who were a cross between Central American apes and native women, and these children were hairy and animal-like, could not speak. And this is in the Spanish records. And at the turn of the century, Wilkins met an Irishman who told of shooting an 8-foot ape who was charging him. Another Latin species that was unusual was seen around 1577 by Jean Lirius, and he was with an admiral on an island in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro when they ran into a huge lizard that was bigger than they were. And after looking each other over, both parties separated peacefully from the accounts that were made later. Well, when a Dutch East India sloop reached an island near Madagascar in 1696, they found birds' nests on the ground many feet in diameter. And Captain Cook discovered similar nests, 26 feet in circumference, on his first voyage into the South Pacific area. An 18th century English traveler in New Siberia mentioned bird tracks 3 feet long and stray feathers 3 or 4 inches in diameter. Now, from such descriptions, these evidently were offshoots of the moa bird. Now, back in the 1800s, there were a number of reports of extinct moa birds being seen in Australia and New Zealand. And Zoologist magazine of the period gives examples. And Popular Science Monthly of 1875 told of a New Zealander who supposedly captured one in a remote pass in New Zealand. It was 8 feet tall. A Perth museum has an egg of one of these giant birds that's almost a foot long. Well, in the early tales of Sinbad, there's mention made of the giant wingless bird called the roc, similar to the moa, and it's Marco Polo that actually saw a bird that could have been a roc off the coast of Madagascar. It looked like this drawing and stood around 7 feet high. These Apiornis, as they were called, were supposed to be extinct for millions of years, yet numerous sightings were made in ancient times. Well, in the Illustrated London News of February 9th in 1856, it was told of finding a huge goose-like monster while a couple of miners were excavating a railroad tunnel. And this monster was black, oily, and after uttering hoarse screeches, it died on them. Experts said it belonged to the genus Petrodactylus anus, pterodactyl family. It was blasted from a million-year-old rock, and no one had the slightest clue of how it could have hibernated that long. But obviously, there were other unhatched creatures that could follow its example across the globe, as we pointed out before. And some other monster birds of this type have been known in the lore of explorers and natives in the very remote regions of this planet. According to a newspaper account of April 1890, a couple of cowboys ran into a huge bird-like creature in the barren desert regions near Tombstone, and after shooting it with their rifles, they cleaned the body and claimed it was 92 foot long, and had bat-like wings that were 160 foot long, and they arrived with some of the bird, tip of the wing and such, as proof in Tucson, Arizona. And the Tombstone, Arizona paper at the time mentioned all of this going on, and they were trying to form a group to go out and find the carcass and bring it back as proof. And no one knows what happened. Lake Elizabeth, California, evidently had a similar huge bird. It lived around it in around the 1890s, and many ranchers and cowboys of the area saw it and tried to kill it before it made off with any more of their cattle. One rancher in the area sold out in 1883 when he encountered it, and it kept running off with his cattle, and the next ranch buyer evidently shot it from very close quarters, and he described it as about 45 foot long with enormous wings and body and several pairs of legs. Over the years, there have been many, many more sightings of huge birds in the East Coast. This is a photo of a huge unidentified bird that was seen dozens of times in an area north of Springfield, Illinois. It's carried off 20-pound pigs and tried to carry off children. And they seem to make loud trumpeting sounds and appear to have wingspans of 10 feet or more, according to the witnesses. This is from a 1985 Sun article. Well, while we're covering the subject of birds, we should look into the more mundane type of birds that have unusual abilities and actions. And ornithologists have now accepted the fact that birds grab up ants in their beaks, for example, and do a strange little ritual, rubbing the ant under their wings. And in a June '57 New Scientist, there was an article that told of a pet rook who'd light matches with his beak and go into this strange posture. In 1970, an issue of American Anthropologist told of hawks in Australia that would snatch up smoldering twigs from the natives' fire there and drop them in areas that would burn out the grass and put the small game on the run so that they could snatch them. Crows are especially noted for adapting to civilized areas and using crude survival logic instinct, and a 1950 Nature magazine told of hundreds of cases of birds opening paper milk bottle lids for the period and to dine on the milk in the porches and things there. And a Native magazine of 1933 told of crows building nests reinforced with barbed wire and baling wire. Well, in our Strange Beings presentation, we see how many humans have actually had their hair changed white over a traumatic incident. Well, there are a number of cases of birds and animals having their hair turn white in a similar traumatic situation in the same way. And these are on the record books. And an old issue of Zoologist told of a blackbird, for example, that molted after a scare and came through with black and white replacements, as in this photo here. This is a noteworthy experiment that we should mention, and that's that in 1913 a Scientific American told of a chicken breeder in England who experimented on growing chickens to maturity in about half the time with only about 2/3 of the feed. And his secret lay in running high-frequency electricity through grid wires all around the chickens where they lived. And the chickens were kept charged up to the point that a little static spark would actually jump from their beaks when they were grounded. And whatever happened to this experiment, who knows? Well, scientists find that the migrating instincts of birds are affected by magnetism. They think there is a mechanism in bird that uses magnetism. Yet the true facts are that all animals possess a type of natural radar that allows them to detect dangers and food at a distance. And birds simply send out this same radar using the soft particle atom electrons in different frequencies. Now, even the soul of birds and animals can leave the area to locate distant objects. Birds and animals both are covered hundreds of miles to find their masters, or what their survival field equated as their food source supply. Nature magazine of 1980 gave an example of a pet pigeon flying 150 miles to be with his young master, who was then in a hospital. It showed up at the window and kept scratching until it was let in. And later we'll cover other examples of our unique radar system in other presentations. Birds that live in caves, like oil birds, have additional sonar that works better in dark cavern-like areas. Bats also have the same system, of course, and the thing we humans don't understand is that all such creatures cannot push their own buttons, since they do not have choice and think like we humans do. They function on automatic, by instinct. Now, luminous birds have been mentioned in numerous texts by ancient naturalists, and Pliny and Solon were examples. And in 1555, Gesner wrote a book on luminous plants and animals, and observed in 1647 that there were many, many varieties of species on this planet that actually glowed, especially in the dark. And Bartholin wrote another volume on the subject telling of cocks, hens, and other fowl that were remarkable for their luminescence. Barn owls seem particularly prone to luminescence, and Science Newsletter of 1947 covered the subject in depth, and according to a British bird journal, several luminescent owls were discovered in 1907, and it was suspected that they had their feathers contaminated by luminous tree bacteria growing in their tree nests. There's a bird called the cigana in lower Amazon regions that has 4 feet at its birth, and as it grows up, the forward feet develop into wings, and the bird resembles a pheasant. And this bird is covered in an 1884 English Mechanic magazine. Well, we all have heard talking parrots and such, but did you know birds learn their particular songs from their parents and others of their species? And when they are first hatched, if they are with other birds of a different species or humans, they will pick up different notes, songs, or speech. Many talking birds are on the record who have been close to humans when they were very young, and they copied the human speech. Now, birds have been known to do very, very unusual things. Now, according to a 1985 tabloid report you just saw, a bird-loving European was saved by his pet swallow. When he fell and became paralyzed in an accident, a swallow he had befriended and constantly fed flew to a neighbor and scratched on a window for 15 full minutes until he eventually got the neighbor out of his chair, got him out of the door, and then he led him by his actions to his farmer neighbor. And as we have mentioned before, most animals will do their very best to preserve their food and affection sources automatically, without thinking, with their little built-in automatic computers. Now, at this point, we should explain that, like animals, birds use and pick up ESP, but their high-gear, souped-up brain action seems to make them harder to get tuned in with by enthusiasts. The persons who attract birds either send a great deal of admiration and affection to a bird and await response, or they use bird language. Well, since very few birds will respond quickly to even the most comforting and affectionate thoughts from most humans, bird lovers can learn the local bird language to increase their success. And bird languages are often different from area to area, so it's sometimes necessary to carefully duplicate the bird song or cry of local varieties. Now, there are recordings that can usually work for most species with a set type of song. And these recordings can be played into an outside speaker, and you can get amazing results. Some humans can get equal results by using their own throats and lips, but this is a talent not everyone has. Lower tones carry the safe, all's well vibes, and the higher, faster vibrations usually indicate a warning and danger. Well, such sound patterns are pretty well universal, and one species quickly learns to pick up on the other species if they're around them any length of time. And nature uses a hypnotic rhythm to hypnotize birds to lock their legs on tree limbs at night. While science isn't aware of the fact yet, animals and birds usually are put into this hypnotic trance by a rhythm corresponding to their pulse beat. And many humans are put in control of a hypnotist by this light little finger tapping pulse that they usually never detect or suspect. It's drummed by a hypnotist. And there are two distinct types of hypnotism, and we cover these in other presentations. Well, this is a brown thrasher, and this dowdy relative of a mockingbird can sing up to 2,000 melodies. Now, male birds sing to impress females and scare off intruders. And in different areas, they produce different singing dialects. Tests have shown that pattern more complex tunes produce healthier species, healthier young. So the better singers are always adopted by the females. Well, many Indian tribes had bat people legends, which mentioned night beings who could draw on the vital power and blood of people. At least some of these traditions probably sprang from the shaman magic of sending animal forms mentally to draw energy from people and communicate. Well, there are many legends telling of earlier deity figures in the likeness of birds, and the source of such legends is found in the Earth Story presentation. The Hopi Indians have long believed that a fearsome underworld deity named Masau'u comes with a mask and a rabbit skin robe. And other so-called kachinas appear at different times. Indians of the Americas use the symbol of the plumed serpent to denote an early spiritual teacher who taught over much of Latin and North America, and he had control over the elements of wind and water, and so the plume represented the wind and the serpent the water. And his battle with the negative condor and weather conditions made him legendary, the thunderbird being a part of this tradition, and it's told of in many Indian legends, and we touch on this elsewhere. Indian shamans, of course, have been known to create mental animal mock-ups or wraith forms to carry out certain activities, like become animals, and the animals actually have been known to harm persons with fear from the negative shaman, and this ability is touched on elsewhere also. Well, while we're touching on the Indian traditions here, I suppose we should go a little further in the bird lore. The Indian traditions, of course, tell of many giant birds that made life exciting for them. One bird they called the piazza bird closely resembled the pterodactyl from accounts, and a well-known cave drawing along the Mississippi River Palisades was a well-known rendering of this bird. Indians had supposedly killed at least two in earlier times, and they're still around, evidently, because in April 1948, several persons in Boone County saw an enormous bird, which was described as at least as large as a small plane, and it looked very much like these pterodactyls. As it migrated down the Mississippi, a number of reliable witnesses saw it in St. Louis area a few days later, and in the 1970s, another big Illinois bird swooped down and picked up a child who it carried about 20 yards, and then dropped. In 1966, two couples were driving along through a wildlife reserve near Mount Pleasant, West Virginia, and they encountered this huge bird creature. It looked somewhat like a grotesque human with wings and no arms. Its eyes, he said, were at least 2 inches in diameter and glowed red in their autolights, and it subsequently chased them at speeds up to 100 miles an hour while it squealed at them. Police later found the creature's 5-inch footprints. In the Sourland Mountains north of Hopewell, New Jersey, there have been a number of encounters with strange half-beast, half-man monsters. These are known locally as the Jersey Devils. Sidney Smith did investigative work in the 1930s and spoke with a number of residents who saw this creature with a human head, horns, and red eyes, and an attached animal body, just as in the descriptions of satires and such. And there were various bush monsters have long been dreaded and described by African natives. They climb over 6-foot fences and steal livestock. Now, in Pontiac, Michigan area a few years ago, there was a monster that looked like this, according to the reports of the couple that it attacked while they were sitting in their car. In 1958, a flying creature with bat-like face and described as a pterodactyl or prehistoric bird swooped out of the January sky, and dozens of witnesses saw it try to attack a human being. Had 20-foot wingspan. 1976 report told of a huge bird-like thing about 4 feet tall with huge folded wings and red glowing eyes that stood under a tree back of a trailer. And the owner of the property went back and saw, and he was staring into an ugly monkey face, he said. He was shocked, ran back inside, locked the doors, and called the police. Of course, they found nothing when they arrived. Well, every now and again, people have similar confrontations with creatures that are so strange and different that they're called UFO creatures. Typical example was in 1976, when the San Benito police officers had a huge bird thing buzz their police car. And later, it scared the wits out of a nearby resident when it landed in the back of his Mobile home. Huge monkey face. A Raymondville, Texas resident was attacked by a creature who had the same features. Well, before we get off subjects so exotic, we should touch upon the fact that there are persons who explain that other beings are so poorly balanced and crave such an animalistic existence that they often wind up spending time in an astral dimension, living out their desires until they're satiated after they die. And according to many who have traveled astrally to these other dimensions, there are literally thousands of people trapped in these desire compounds or dimensions until they get it out of their system. And many of them are very strange looking and distorted, as you see here. Well, turning from the sublime to the ridiculous for a moment, let's look at rats. Few people realize that rats are next to human in their adaptability and survival ability. A human has what we call a 5-point digestive system that allows us to digest anything from grass, soup, to nuts, while the rat is right next to us with a 4-point system that will digest just about as much variety. Now, if he weren't around, the rat would be king of the animals on this planet. Rats multiply at an astonishing rate, and theoretically 2 rats could have 250,000 descendants in 10 years. Well, today, rats eat the production of 2 million average farms, or food produced by every 15th farm in the world. Rats were responsible for the death of 1/2 of Europe during the Great Plagues. This is more people than have died in all of the wars that have ever been fought. Well, there are at least twice as many rats as people today, and they're divided into the black rats, which took the dry parts of the world, and the brown rats, which took the wet parts of the world. And in ancient times, this battle for territory took them 15 years to work out in bloodshed, and war among the rats. And it was finally settled. Now, the picture here is of the Ollschlager, rat exterminators of Paris, who kill millions of European rats yearly. Ollschlager tells of finding legendary rat kings who have a dozen or so females linked together by their tails with some sticky glue that they have. These serve as breeding centers for rat communities, and there can be anywhere from 8 to 80 rats in these communities, all stuck together, being fed by others of the community. And rats, incidentally, have no compunction about attacking people, elephants, or any other creatures when they're hungry enough. Well, let's take a look at how animals can predict weather. Nature provides most animals with some degree of weather predicting ability for their survival. And snowy owls, for example, know ahead of time whether the weather will be snowy in an area, and if they can't find any snowy owls in their usual haunts in the northwest, well, you can bet it'll be a mild winter. Old-timers in the St. Louis or elsewhere keep an eye out for monarch butterfly migrations. And if they are on time, they know the winter will be prompt and mild. Well, up in Maine, if the ducks and geese hang around until late fall, we know that the winters will come a little late. Most birds that migrate can tell the same story. Many animals grow more fur if there's a hard winter on the way. And an example is the coyote, who grows a bushier tail, and he'll use this tail in the winter later as a blanket to keep his face and nose warm. Animals that hibernate, like woodchucks and squirrels, will gather more food than normal. If there's a hard winter coming, they'll gorge themselves until they're so fat they can hardly waddle, and mice will get out of the fields and invade warm barns or anywhere they think that it'll be a little warmer if there's a cold winter coming up, to stay out of all the cold and snow. And down in the southwest, old-timers know that grouchy, restless rattlesnakes and other snakes in the fall portend a hard winter. Even the spiders get busier just before a hard winter, and they spin more webs, store up more food in their insect larders. Before a hard winter, queen bees lay more eggs and the workers collect more honey. The woodpeckers more or less stay by themselves and don't even stick with their mate that much unless there's a hard winter coming. And then they start living together to keep warmth in their hole, I suppose. A long-range weather prediction isn't the animal's only specialty. The next time you see a horse out frisking around in the pasture, cavorting around, you'll probably see rain within a day. So keep your eyes open, and you may pick up on nature's little weather forecasters. The next time you see your favorite squirrel putting away more nuts and food, you'll know what's coming up. In the 11th chapter of the Christian's Bible, there are references to clean and unclean food. And while the majority of persons have heard of this concept, probably not 1 in 100 believes in the concept now. Basically, clean animals under biblical laws usually have had more than one stomach and did not scavenge. Now, rabbits, pigs, tuna, lobster, catfish were typical unclean foods. And in this drawing, pictorial, you'll see some of the other unclean foods. Now, in most cases, we find that the unclean animals simply don't filter the food they eat and are prone to carry parasites or worms harmful to humans. And remarkably, we find that predators such as cats will often favor the clean animals in their diets, and they won't eat many of these unclean animals, such as bears. Now, to we humans who have no instinct, we taste sheep, bear, whatever it is, we taste about the same thing. Persons who've run through tests on human deaths have found a surprising number were caused by persons suffering from worm infestations from eating pork and other worm-infested meat. Well, how many other illnesses and death result from eating other unclean food would probably be equally startling to persons who find the subject ridiculous. The nature or natural tribes in remote areas of the world usually have instinct enough to stay away from unclean food. And one article in a 1945 issue of Nature showed hornets won't even eat many unclean foods and meats. They would repeatedly shun the unclean meat, and especially from birds, many types of unclean birds. Now, deer, of course, are clean. And cows are clean. Most beef animals are clean. Grasshoppers are clean. Grasshoppers, of course, are used by many, many natives all over the world. Were used by many of the tribes in the desert back in the times of Moses. Many species of grasshopper that we have in this area of the world, of course, aren't big enough to bother with, usually, but in other areas of the world, the grasshoppers and locusts are often much larger. And this is one of the large species that is of actual large enough to catch a mouse, as this picture shows. Now, there are certain bodybuilders that explain that they cannot gain weight or it will lose strength if they eat unclean food, like pork, which is so popular in the United States. And Moses was not a stupid person. And for some reason or another, many of the unclean foods are evidently deleterious to the human system. And we may not know, according to our science, the reasons for this yet, but there are evidently reasons beyond the infections and the carryover of worms infestations in the meat, trichinosis and such. There are evidently reasons beyond this that we do not understand yet. And we do have more information on this subject. And most of it is in the Bible. Well, mention of the unicorn has been made from the earliest times, and it's mentioned in the Bible by authors like Pliny and various later historians. Usual description resembled a horse with a single horn in the center of the skull. Yet in the early times there was one skull that was sent to royalty in Quedlinburg that had a horn many feet in length and was attached to the skull. Accounts from Africa indicate there were a number of unicorns there until the 1800s. Natives prized them for their hides and meat. In an 1848 Scientific American, several African specimens actually got to England. According to another mid-1800s report, there were sightings in what is now Massachusetts area in earlier times. An English sailor, for example, told of a horse-like creature with a foot-long horn growing from the forehead in the 1560s. A French explorer Bernard de la Harpe wrote in 1719 that he'd seen unicorns in what is now the Louisiana Territory around the Red River. He said they were all about the size of a horse, had reddish long hair, and a half-a-foot horn in the middle of their forehead. Well, de la Harpe mentioned that the Indians hunted and ate them, and the meat was very palatable. And it's thought that that's probably one of the problems that erased the unicorn from the American continent. Well, not surprisingly enough, there are quite a few four-legged animals that occasionally show genetic throwbacks to a time when there were more of their forebears growing single horns for protection. And this goat is an example from Northern California. Many persons wonder how animals communicate, and we'll cover this subject here. Hundreds of persons in this part of the world have the ability to mentally communicate with animals. And many of these persons have come out with books on their experiences, and many more, though, prefer to keep their abilities to themselves because persons without this ability are often skeptical and unkind in their reactions. This is animal trainer Barbara Woodhouse, and she's the author of Talking to Animals. And she and many other persons in this field have added invaluable insight to speaking with animals, and this insight goes far beyond what the scientists are now aware of. To gain a foundation into how ESP communication occurs, it's necessary to understand a few points about animals that are not included in the usual text on the subject. First, all animals have an invisible component that takes charge of the body and holds the knowledge of the animal species and carries over the knowledge held by prior existences. An animal, for example, that has had many existences as a dog associated with human masters will, as a result, be more prone to work better with humans and get more out of such relationships. Now, this soul or data gathering component is actually the total of what the dog is and has been. And it has a vast amount of experience and knowledge to draw on for the dog's or other animals' survival. Like all things in the universe, the material particles of matter cycle into non-material and back again. And the soul, as we call it, is simply the non-material side of matter and has a memory within it to help its and its species survive better. A monkey that learns to survive better by opening up nuts or even civilized canned food will transmit this knowledge to all other members of its soul or species group after a matter of time. And this astonishing effect is known as the 100th monkey effect, and it's now well known by persons in the field. Now, this knowledge needs no carryover by verbal means. It's carried over by the soul knowledge and transmuted and transmitted through the genetic structures. And the monkeys are automatically born with the knowledge. The human animal body carries the same type of soul, but has several additional mind components that make our species totally different in our use of knowledge. We constantly do without the automatic soul instinct of animals, and usually rely on a logic and reason, needing to constantly make choices and constantly learn the hard way. Well, the instinct knowledge of humans was erased thousands of years ago during a period of brain circuit change. And this was at the allegoric time of the Garden of Eden, and it's a longer subject covered in more detailed reports. A thing that we should remember is that the animals just act, for the most part, on instinct, and humans constantly assume that animals choose and think like the humans do, which is an incorrect assumption. Animals are guided by their souls, and the soul's main concern is the survival of the animal body in the face of threats. An animal that's close to a human, like a dog, will have a soul that knows its best survival chances center around this human and the human output of shared food. And any threat to the human is viewed by the soul as a threat to the animal, and the dog will even go so far as to jump in a lake and pull out a drowning master under this instinct soul guidance. Now, cats who more easily adapt to hunting and other food sources do not need these close human attachments and are usually freer spirits and less able to tolerate restrictions. Now, an understanding how the animal reacts to its instinct guidance is necessary because most humans are totally wrong about animal motivations. Animals do not think like humans. We humans ate of the fruit of knowledge thousands of years ago, and it changed our mind circuitry, so to speak, and we cover this subject in depth in other presentations here. Animals act and react according to their soul dictates, and when you see them in positions like this, you know that they're only doing it for two things. One of two things: they're doing it for food or affection. In either case, it's part of their survival, because without affection, they do not survive, and it's so much easier to mooch off humans. So in mentally communicating with animals, you're going to only get a very simple, basic thought picture based on emotions, much like a child. There simply won't be any of the usual complications. There won't be any of the judgments that are typical in human thought. If you read a human, they'll frequently have negative thoughts based on judgments between good and bad. An animal will never make such judgments. It'll simply express its feelings and desires. If it's missing a companion, hungry, or craving more affection, you'll instantly know it by the basic thought expressions and actions. This basic sincerity and undevious action is obviously why so many persons often get to the point they prefer the company of animals to humans. Well, humans aren't so simple. They're very complex and hard to understand and deal with, and half of the humans around are frequently using facades and acting in ways different than they're speaking. It's very confusing. Is it any wonder, then, that simplistic animals with their concentration on fun and affection are so popular with persons who can't get much communication or fun and affection from other humans? Well, what helps a great deal in an animal-human relationship is when a human can start to unhook some of their warped mind circuits and get into the simple, basic brain-body relationships that cut out all this mind nonsense that's usual. Become as little children. When a human can stop playing mind games and setting up false values and walls, then it gets easier and easier to use telepathy with animals. Telepathy is the universal language, and it's used between virtually all species except man. And any animal that is in a pleasurable brain dwell and has no predators around to keep its thoughts away from pleasure will be able to send and receive the thoughts of other animals around it. The little cries and vocal communications are only automatically brought on to accent the nonverbal communications or to gain instant attention in the face of danger. Now, animals cry out to get help, and not because they're in acute pain. Animals usually have a completely different pain threshold than humans do. Animals can be wounded or diseased and feel little or no pain. Now, humans with less pain tolerance are always assuming animals hurt and are suffering. Yet when they confront the battered dog, which should be in agony, the dog will wag his tail and show signs of complete absence of pain if there's any affection at all going back and forth. Now, we humans equate affection with love, and yet to most degree they're not the same at all, and there are at least 5 different types of love, and affection is actually a wavelength. And we go into this in other presentations. And with affection, miracles can occur and pain can be eliminated. And science had known nothing about pain thresholds and actions until the early 1960s. And in the future, there will be some surprising discoveries to prove the points we've just gone across here to the skeptical. And even now, we know that many humans feel very little pain compared to other humans. Now, one of the first prerequisites for talking with animals and using ESP is this total commitment to staying in a good, positive mind frame and using affection. We must appreciate and love life forms around us and stay pleasurable if we're ever going to retain these vibrates required for ESP and the communication with these life forms. By recognizing animals as beings and soul bearers who are part of the same creative principles as ourselves, we can tap the same communication bands. Now, most of the noted persons who can pick up other animals' thoughts and have written books on the subject and such are spiritual, loving persons who seldom have gotten too entrenched in the rat race. J. Allen Boone is a good example. He's a well-known psychic who wrote a book on animal communication back in the 50s. And he discovered that a famous German shepherd under his care was not easily dominated and put under control when there were no good reasons for it. Later, he formed a mental communication with Strongheart that changed his life and views, and Kinship with All Life is an excellent book that describes Boone's first experiences and is very uplifting. Fred Kimball was another individual that publicly admitted talking to animals and became quite well known for teaching others this same ability. Beatrice Lydecker was another Californian shown here that became an expert in the field and wrote What the Animals Tell Me. And she treated hundreds of animals that had emotional problems from needs their owners didn't recognize. She would mentally ask the animals why they were unhappy, and the animals could and did usually respond immediately and accurately. And soon she was working with many vets who found she could unravel difficult cases that were far beyond their scope. And both she and Fred Kimball were generally psychic, and this greatly added to their ability to see into a sick animal body problem. Now, in cases of this psychic ability, it's simply a case of a human soul being able to send out a radar type of energy to look over another object or to talk to another soul. And this soul-to-soul communication is simply a little higher step in human ESP, and is a subject covered elsewhere. Now, the soul communication can confuse the understanding in normal ESP to some degree. Normally, for example, animals could care less about time, amounts, numbers, and such. And when some trainers and psychics get animals to count or give answers relating to numbers, then it is usually not the animal giving the answers through thought. It is simply a case of the animal coming up with a trainer's thoughts or requirements. Now, this is a very subtle or deceptive concept that even psychics usually don't recognize. And if people act and move around a time schedule, animals will simply react to the human schedule, not the time concept itself. Keep this in mind now. This knowledge could keep you from being deceived about animals knowing what they don't know in the future. Well, animals are far ahead of humans in their ability to enjoy the little things in life, and humans are brainwashed into cutting off their emotions and slowly losing their fun and joy in living. And Beatrice Lydecker shown here, has learned to communicate because she can go back to a childlike state in the mental frame that is very simple, simplistic. And she can enjoy her animals, and they enjoy her, and they're on the same wavelength and tuned into each other. And it's just as simple as that. Well, animals can enjoy these small, constant pleasures and natural activities that are without cost. And here Lydecker works with a sick parrot. It has throat problems, hasn't been relieved of emotions enough. She quickly finds out the problem by communication. Well, one thing that Lydecker mentions is that most animals do not have the same drive for sex as humans. And since it's the human minds that are tied in with sex, pleasure, and memories, and the animals do not have minds, this is easy to figure out. Animals only have a drive toward sex the same way they have a drive toward food when the right time comes. Cyclic. Beatrice Lydecker estimated that 90% of the animals she asked about it said they didn't want litters and babies, and it's just that they came along, and they didn't understand why. Animals, she also explained, will frequently ride each other in a display of dominance, not in sex drive. Now, after speaking with hundreds and even thousands of animals, she has this to say about spaying and neutering. She says it's most beneficial to them, and it causes no harm or difficulty whatsoever. Well, the simplest key to mental communication, or ESP, is the forming of clear mental impressions to send, and in getting in receptive enough mood to pick up returned pictures. Humans who say one thing and often picture another often have trouble sending out clear mental images. To send a signal to an animal, just call their name or get their attention, and next send a vocal or visual picture of what you wish mentally. Picture exactly what you wish. Keep it simple, and since animals can't conceive of negative, mind-oriented concepts, leave out all the don'ts and can'ts. Just keep it simple. Now, you can send these messages to animals or humans any place you're at, in any condition. And it's very simple if you can stay relaxed and keep this clear mental picture. Well, visualize the dog getting your affection in an area away from a taboo area if you want a dog to go outside and piddle outside. Receiving answers now is harder because the mind simply can't relax very long. It takes a blank receptive state. You can mentally probe the animal and try to interpret the animal's feelings and thoughts, and you won't be fooled. And keeping your thought about yourself free of your picture, you can't think of yourself at the same time. You have to think of the animal. Now, the mind will fill in a lot of its usual deductions, guesses, and yet after practice, you'll get the animal's unique feelings if you keep practicing. Now, of course, most people have been brainwashed by their mummies and daddies into fearing various animals, and anybody who fears animals will often send out a clear picture of themselves getting bitten or hurt by the animals. And this, of course, is what the animal is getting in their heads as a picture. And that's what they sometimes do, unless they're trained not to. Now, because generations of breeding for looks instead of brains, there are many American pedigreed dogs today that are mentally deficient and retarded. Now, dogs, for example, will normally return affection, while a very retarded animal will only be interested in receiving love. The outward joy they show may be only self-centered and centered around receiving. Well, some persons wonder how animals can find lost masters over a great deal of distance. And because the animal soul is in the timeless dimension, which is not held to time or distance, any animal can send their soul to distant points in an instant to gain information. And lost animals will do this to find distant masters. There are many cases have been known to where they've walked hundreds of miles to link up with these lost masters. The animals simply tune into the mental pictures the distant masters are holding or getting, and if these pictures are negative, can make the unhappy animals unhappy and sad. And constantly there are pictures being sent by the master to the dog. And it's good if we send the picture in an affectionate way, visualizing the master giving the dog affection once in a while, instead of pain and negativity. And this works both ways, of course. There are persons who are a little psychic, so to speak, that can reverse the situation and tune in on a distant or lost pet in the same way. A little vibrational sample of the pet is provided as a witness. Virtually any other life form that's tuned in, and slightly psychic if a human, can locate the lost animal or even object. Now, unfortunately, pets pick up anger between family members and owners and think it's often somehow their fault. And this can lead to frustration and a turning on themselves with self-injury or punishment. And any dog who's gnawing on themselves and miserable will often have a guilt complex that he's done something to cause this inharmony that's around him. Dogs are very sensitive, pick up slightest mental pictures of humans if they tune in. That's why they're so helpful in war situations, as this picture shows. Used during the First World War. Sends out soldiers in trouble and in pain, shot. Now, once you understand these basic foundation principles, you often know what's wrong with an animal ahead of time, even without psychic ability. But it's so easy to tune in on animals. And, for instance, animals who relieve themselves in a taboo area are often trying to drive away someone. They don't like someone, and that's their way to try to drive them away. And other abnormal actions are usually reactions to the lack of emotional fulfillment and attention. Most dogs are ignored too much. When the situation's cleared up by change in the cause, the problem's eliminated. If it can be changed, the animal can be disciplined if it isn't. And you'll know how to discipline and when to discipline, because there is an obstinance that comes up even when the animal knows what the situation is. But that's very seldom. Most animals go out of their way to try to be helpful and follow what they mentally visualize the human is sending to them. Persons that are good with children are usually good with animals because there's a similarity. There's a simplicity there. And dogs, for example, are very much like children. For pets, it's important that they have things like their own food dish, just like a child, and the same show of affection that another pet gets. Or just like a child, they get hurt. And even though time in this show may vary, and in time, animals can become brainwashed or set in a pattern, though, just like humans. And if owners encourage bad tempers or bad habits, it sometimes ruins the chances of another owner ever accepting an animal. And unhappy animals often show fear and have bad habits like snapping at others and barking constantly. And by using ESP, it can sometimes help to find these deeper motivations. So training dogs or any animal is very simple. And to practice ESP with your pet, you practice holding that clear mental picture of what you wish to occur, while you look them in the eye, preferably. And if you hide an object and mentally visualize where it's hidden, and then visualize the pet getting it and getting a reward, you may soon be in business and have a dog that'll fetch for you. Remember, the reward must be food or affection. If the animal isn't hungry or doesn't like the tidbit that you're mentally offering, then there'll be very little incentive. And some animals, of course, like playing games like fetching and naturally take to it just like a duck to water. Now, when you're around a Doberman like this, instead of having a fear and sending up fear vibrations and visualizing him biting you, you visualize how handsome he is, and having him come up and lick you and be friendly with you. And it works 9 times out of 10. Unless the dog is completely driven to be a guard dog and not have any relations with other people. You can walk by a guard dog in a pen within a compound, and 9 out of 10 will show affection when you show affection first to them. And by sending a picture of something like, well, maybe a flea on the animal's leg, you can prove to yourself how well ESP works, because you can actually get the animals to scratch at the area that you visualize in many cases. And much depends on the bond between the owner and the animal, and cats and wild animals will seldom respond to anything or communicate guidance that's outside their own guidelines or survival goals. There's a farm in Hot Springs, Arkansas that specializes in training animals, and most all of their work is done with food rewards. Most of the time you see the animals in the circus, or in the fish, especially, and the little penguins in SeaWorld and places like this. They always have a little tidbit to feed after the animal performs, and this is the way that they're taught to perform. It works almost every time. And thousands of animals have responded to tidbits on this farm after they've danced or played music or performed some other stunt. Animals like elephants are prone to be responsive toward affection, and they aren't usually affected by the surroundings as much as smaller or high-strung dogs. Animals must be free of stress. If you have a little nervous, high-strung dog, you have to calm him down before you can get him to do anything. And chickens, for example, will get sick after continual stress, and birds, like chickens that get soft music and in good environment, will put on more weight with less feed. They have found in tests, bird ranches and chicken farms, and they stay healthy. The minute you pipe in rock music and other hard rock type of music, it sickens them eventually. Well, horses communicate with each other through around 100 vocal sounds and body languages and telepathy. And a horse, for example, that rears his head and sniffs in very quickly is communicating that he senses danger in the area. And when they nibble on each other, it's a way of showing affection. And if there's a little jumping around and motion with it, that means there's emphasis on this affection point. Probably in love with the other horse. To indicate they want you to leave, a horse will usually kick their right front foot backward. And there's a high-pitched whinny, of course, that we've all heard, which is a request for food. And to say hello to a horse family, and many other four-footed animals, you approach them with your hands behind your back and blowing gently through your nose, like you're sniffing. And this works 9 out of 10 times for the horse family. Don't do it with dogs. You'll insult them. Now, there are a number of racetrack bettors that have learned these little secret codes that horses use to communicate with each other, and they regularly win at the track using this information. And Henry Blake, the gentleman we saw with the 3 horses just prior to this view, is a person that has a book out on the subject of horse language. Well, many animals and species, like the dolphins, rely more on intensity of expressions and sequence in sound than in vowel sounds, as we humans relate to. Dogs usually have a little ritual that they go through. They sniff and wag their tails if the meeting's friendly, and cats, on the other hand, wag their tail when they're showing anger. Most animals quickly learn that coming up to a human with some nuzzling and rubbing will get them a handout. Many of us don't realize that there are many species that will instinctively refrain from hurting other members of their own species. They'll even share their own food. And the only reason that most animals fight or kill is to protect their tribe or eat when they're hungry. And when wounded, other whales, dolphins, elephants, monkeys, and such will usually help their wounded kin or own kind. Now, we previously mentioned Barbara Woodhouse. She's trained over 14,000 dogs, usually does so in less than a few minutes. She said she had less than half a dozen failures, and all of them were due to the idiocy level of the flunkouts. Here she has a dog that's pouring flakes in a bowl of water. She visualizes the dog taking the pipe and filling it with water and blowing. And this is the amazing result. And the dog enjoys it. Barbara Woodhouse is one of the few psychics in this field that explains and is well aware that the soul of an animal continues in the body of a later animal. Dog to dog, so to speak. Animal reincarnation, if you would. Now, Barbara Woodhouse here occasionally finds pets who die, and the soul enters the body of another pet in the same general area a few weeks or a few months later. And this doesn't happen very often, but it has occurred. Now, occasionally, there are very, very unusual situations like this where ghost pets, ghost animals will supposedly save their owners. And in situations like this, it is the person's own soul that takes the kinetic energy and saves them, and it gives them the impression that it is an animal, which it can do, because our sensing receptors are being fed the information by the soul. It can feed any information it wants into the human, and this gets rather involved, but it's done because people wouldn't believe in another approach, and the soul feels that this is the best way to handle the matter. And it happens all the time. People are usually in car accidents or something, or they're going toward an accident, and within seconds of crashing, the car will suddenly careen around the object that they were going to hit, and the person finds himself up the highway, and they're blanked out. They don't remember what occurred. And this is another case of where the soul uses kinetic energy to work the so-called miracle. And this is the same situation, except they're using an animal to be the fall guy, so to speak. And it isn't the animal at all. It is a duplicate, a doppelganger. And we'll go into this in other demonstrations and other works in other presentations. It's a rather long subject to get into. Another situation that comes up once in a while is where the person is very young and they're put in with other species and learn the language of the species they're with. For example, 65 years ago, a German woman named Beamer shut up her young son in their chicken yard because he kept wandering away. And in a couple of weeks, he automatically picked up their language and could easily converse with chickens. And after he grew up, this doctor Balmer found that chickens, more than any other birds, keep the same language from area to area, unlike most birds who have decided dialects in their own respective home areas. Well, about as far back as recorded history, there's been a fascination with dolphins. And instinctively, we've all known that there's something very different and unique about this species, and so our interest has always remained. And it wasn't until the 60s in the present society that we began to seriously study dolphins, but the ancient cultures were serious long before us. And their stories tell of dolphin friendships with humans of the time, and their coins have pictures of dolphins on them as a tribute. Now, Plutarch tells of a dolphin saving the son of Odysseus when he fell in the water some 10,000 years ago, and the story has been repeated in case after case since then. Shakespeare and Herodotus, of the great historian, both wrote of the dolphins. They wrote of the singer and poet Arion, saved in a similar fashion a few hundred years before Christ. There was a Roman coin that was minted that had a boy riding a dolphin, in commemoration of several stories about such events. Well, the Greeks and Romans both had pictures and frescoes of dolphins in their various temples, and this is dolphins from the Palace of Knossos. It's now in the Archaeological Museum at Heraklion, Crete. And numerous friezes on the walls were abstract patterns and a floral motif. And the ancients had very high regard for dolphins. There were other reasons than dolphins saving men. But of course today this still happens. And a number of persons in our time have been saved by riding dolphins to shore after mishaps. Not only have dolphins pushed drowning humans ashore, they've been seen to chase sharks away from stranded humans adrift. And they frequently help each other when there's danger. Being it is their nature to protect their breathing young, to get air, it's only a step further to aiding drowned humans to get air when they're in trouble. Well, dolphins are about the only fish family that seem to go to great lengths to protect their own species against these outside dangers, and Aristotle in his 9th book on animals tells of a school of dolphins coming into Caria harbor until a captive and wounded dolphin was released by fishermen there. And in recent history, the fishermen of some parts of Japan have long had a feud going with dolphins because they interfere with the fishing profits. Seems that in March and November of each year, the dolphins migrate into the Japanese water and are slaughtered by the thousands in the past, and some are used for livestock food, and most are just killed to keep them from eating the fish in the area. And one American named Kate went to Japan and saved hundreds of dolphins in 1980 by slashing Japanese fishing nets. And after jail and heavy fines, he aided in getting more public sympathy on the problem. Well, there are several reports since then of thousands of dolphins blocking Japanese harbors and actual fighting back to some degree after such wanton slaughters of their brethren taking place there. And unfortunate the Japanese can't work with the dolphins. Don't try, because in ancient times Pliny tells of dolphins working with the fishermen to scare mullet into shallows where both could benefit. And later the fishermen rewarded the dolphins with food when they weren't so plentiful. Now here near Athens, the records show that dolphins helped the Greek fishermen in a similar manner at night. And there are various Aborigine and island people who have worked mutually with dolphins in catching fish for as long as the traditions go back in these parts of the world, and books on dolphins cover some of these actions in detail. Now, some of the South Sea Island people were known to be able to project their ESP to distant dolphins and bring them into the area on certain occasions. In the poems of Opium, he mentions that by the devising of Dionysius, dolphins exchanged the land for the sea and put on the forms of fishes. And what is clearer to the truth is that the souls, or non-material components of certain ancient humans, occasionally wound up in the body of the dolphin. Well, this phenomena stemmed from the time when the last great influx of colonists, or exiled gods, came to Earth and selected and tried various types of animal bodies to try out, according to the legends. Now, these ancient traditions say that the gods were spirit matter, or pure energy, on their arrival here on this planet, and they had to enter and take on the material bodies of animal forms before they could function in this material world. And out of thousands of these fallen angels, many later found that they preferred the ocean to the land, and since the dolphin body was one of the best adapted creatures of the ocean, it was this form that most of their beings preferred. Now, eventually the souls of virtually all of these beings found experience in human bodies, and cultures were a little more suitable to progress, and so they abandoned the dolphin bodies. But they left a genetic legacy in the dolphin species of their DNA intelligence. Now, this is why dolphins appear to be next to humans in their intelligence. Now, we don't have time to cover this whole subject here because it's covered elsewhere. But this is why the ancient cultures, such as the Greeks, had such reverence toward the dolphins, actually building temples for them, because the DNA genetic intelligence factor, the dolphins have an insight that no other animal or mammal species has. Like dogs, dolphins are not only able to perform with man, they're willing to do so, unlike species such as cats who simply won't cooperate with anybody. Well, they form these deep emotional bonds with their mates, each other, and some humans. And some die of grief when their mates pass away. Like most animals, dolphins have a type of sonar or radar that's extremely acute. And in tests, fish back of glass are ignored because this radar picks up the obstacle that their eye cannot. Now, the Pharaoh's lighthouse was one of the ancient wonders of the world a few hundred years before Christ, and it had a reflector that could be seen for 40 miles by mariners coming into the Greek port of Alexandria, the head of the Nile. It also had huge sound pipes and underwater bells that were used to broadcast signals to dolphins so that they could guide the ships into the harbor. Now, this is in the records. Now, dolphins of the time would find ships within a few hundred miles and guide them toward the lighthouse for a reward of fish or food. And by staying in the area before a ship bow, they could get a free ride most of the way to the lighthouse. Now, because of the safety of Alexandria's shipping, with the aid of these dolphins, it became the major port of the old world, with distribution and much of the world's goods went through this port at one time. Then the destruction of the Alexandrian library then, a few years later, left little of the exact details of this operation and how this lighthouse worked in exact detail, and how the sound pipes worked. And all we're getting today is the second-hand accounts of this lighthouse, and we do know, however, that the dolphins were instrumental in guiding the ships to the harbor and making this port the great success that it was back then. Well, if porpoises are so smart, why aren't they rich? That it pointed out here in this cartoon. This is because, as we pointed out, that they carry the DNA pattern only. They do not carry the soul pattern, which carries all of the combined information that's built up over thousands of years. And if dolphins were still receiving humanoid souls, they'd be making machines, and they'd be having a unit value system under the ocean like our money. And they have neither. So all they have actually is the DNA carryover of intelligence. And as I say, we do cover this subject in the Earth Story report. Well, since animals work by instinct, they have very little need for table manners and the usual human customs. As a side note here, I might add that many of the European customs concerning table manners came from the South American civilizations. When Cortez conquered Moctezuma, Moctezuma made Cortez and the Spanish manners shameful, because it was he who had the knives and forks and napkin holders and tablecloths and such, and these spread to Europe and became European customs, which of course were introduced into our country later, but as a side note, of course. Now, in 1799, there was an American Philosophical Society journal that Thomas Jefferson often recorded interesting articles in, and wrote articles for, and he recorded that some workmen in West Virginia unearthed the bones and claws of a close relative to a lion who was 3 times the size of a normal lion. And he also noted a strange beast who gave earth-shaking roars and carried off a West Virginia horse, just like it was a sheep. Well, P.T. Barnum was a mastermind when it came to figuring out what the public liked to see, and he went to England and bought Jumbo, the gigantic elephant, brought him to New York, created a sensation when he showed him in Madison Square Garden and later showed him in his museum. Was popular for many years. In various ship logs, there are occasional references to actual whales and large fish caught in the ice of giant icebergs. This is an example, way back in the 1800s. Well, as we mentioned earlier, in 1977, a Japanese fisherman snagged the corpse of a plesiosaur, or marine reptile. It thought to be extinct for 60 million years. And pictures and samples of the creature convinced the various university experts in Japan of the catch, but the closed-minded skeptics dismissed the event and made excuses why it couldn't have happened and why it wasn't a plesiosaur. Well, scenes like this have actually occurred several times on the East Coast, and no one has ever figured out where these strange monsters come from. Well, the rarest and most dangerous animal for its size in the Western world is probably the wolverine. The Indians have long called this little animal the evil one and the Indian devil. Story after story are told about how this crafty animal plays fiendish little tricks on the trappers who are in its territory, and when cornered by another beast or man, it could kill either with a savage effectiveness that was unmatched by any species known. And trappers particularly despised these animals because they'd make the rounds of the traps, and they'd not only eat the trapped animals, and they'd steal and destroy the trappers' traps. Well, in 1883, in Scientific American, there was mention of a large reptile like this that was shot 36 times and eventually killed when it was shot in the head, and it was sent to La Paz. It's the last was ever heard of it. Well, then the American Naturalist of 1869 tells of a continuous stream of common American crows flying by soldiers that held up to 85,000 birds. Now, the passenger pigeons, of course, were very numerous in these early days of our country. And in the New Scientist of 1958, there is mention of crow courts. So down through history now, where old and feeble birds that evidently don't hold their own responsibilities, they're judged by a crow group. And if they're judged guilty and they're sentenced, they're pecked to death. And most animals leave their stragglers to die when they endanger the tribe. And humans did this once upon a time, long ago, some thousands of years ago, before their intelligence was changed, as it is today. Well, we all remember the passenger pigeon that I just mentioned that thrived in our nation in the younger days, and there were millions and billions of them, and they're now extinct. And each few years there are species that become extinct because an area is hunted or used beyond the fine line of too much. And while the conservation groups maybe go a little overboard at times, please remember to support them, because they're about the only salespeople and spokespeople for the animal kingdom. Here are examples of animals that are now extinct on this planet. Well, if you don't think nature's clever by this time, dear hearts, take a look at this. This is a virus, and it's a piece of molecular machinery. The tail fibers that you see recognize the surface of a bacterium and grab onto the surface, and then the little end plate comes down to the surface, and it cuts a hole through the cell wall of the bacterium, and the sheath collapses, and this part gets jammed into the bacteria wall, and the DNA moleculars are injected into the cell, where it proceeds to take over the molecular machinery of the cell, directing it to produce more of these little viruses. And then the cell bursts, and you have more of these little viruses around, and pretty soon they're all over the place. And since they attack bacteria, this illustrates that even germs get sick. Well, it wasn't too many years ago that the very old prints showed that we had dragons and unicorns and types of animals that we now considered extinct. But to them, in those days, they evidently felt that they were still around. Something to think about. Well, since we know that reptiles like the dragons emerge from eggs, it may be pretty logical to assume there may be legs still around on this planet that will hatch forth dragons again, just like there once was. Another thing to think about. And here's some plesiosaurus and ichthyosaurus, and the first amphibians and mammalia. And here's a Mesosaurus and some Telesaurus. There's a labyrinthodon, an iguanodon, and a megalosaurus in combat. It's a good idea not to believe everything you see, because science is constantly changing their opinions about how things were back then. For instance, a Science Digest issue of 1981 pointed out that a century ago science felt that the dinosaur looked like the model it left, where in actuality many now feel that the dinosaur looked like the model at the right. Quite a bit of difference. Well, this is the giant sloth. And a few years ago, a whole band of British hunters went to search for this monster in Patagonia. It was rumors that there were some tamed by primitive South Americans there. And the expeditions never did come up with one, however. Well, these are the type of ancient plants that turned into coal, and gave us the coal that we have all over the planet. Well, supposedly turned into oil too, but don't you believe it. We'll go into this subject some other day. Now, there are hundreds of cases in the records where frogs and frog-like creatures have fallen from the sky, and why this occurs is anybody's guess. Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. It's one of the earlier books that records and chronicles a lot of these early events, and they're still continuing across the globe. Another look at what historians of the past felt was reality at the time. Remember King Kong? It was made by Ernest Schoedsack back in 1933. It was a masterpiece of special effects. As we mentioned a little earlier, there were actual cases of giant gorillas coming into the native villages a few years before it was made, and probably an inspiration for the movie. Here, King Kong rips the wings off of a giant prehistoric bird that attempted to attack Miss Ray near the gorilla. Here, Driscoll and the girl escape King Kong by sliding down a vine to drop into the lake at the base of the cliff. Well, they finally capture Kong by drugging him, and then they spirit him away to America. Here he is in the Broadway Theater on exhibition. And then he suddenly goes berserk and breaks his bonds. And he goes on a rampage of death and destruction. Well, in these memorable final scenes, he stands on the Empire State Building and fights the battle with the machine gun bullets and finally plunges to his death. And here's the mighty Kong after he plunges to his death. And what do you classify vampires as? Humanoids? Animals? You'll enjoy the Strange Beings presentation if you want to find out about vampires. Very detailed coverage on why they exist, why they do what they do. There are many types of vampires, and not all of them are men. Some are energy vampires. Some are blood vampires. We go into depth in this on the Strange Beings presentation. Well, every now and then wolves go on the rampage, in India especially. In the early 80s, there were an attack of third time in 74 years that Indian wolves had run amok and slaughtered many children. There are 180 little children that had been savagely attacked and eaten alive by the fearless packs of wolves. And what about werewolves? Well, they've been recognized and feared for thousands of years, and there seems to be two types of werewolves. The conjured other dimensional types that are mentally created, and the actual physical types that savagely kill humans. An example of a typical or recent attack occurred in a village 150 miles southwest of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and 37 persons were murdered and mutilated by what one eyewitness called a hairy-bodied humanoid with wolf's head. More peaceful conjured werewolves are from a practice called weir-changing, or lycanthropy. All through history there are traditions of priests and shamans who can alter their human spirit body shape into another animal form. Well, in primitive societies, shamans would use the animal bodies to escort diseased tribe members to the afterworld, or lead wolf packs to other areas away from the tribal sheep and cattle, or simply to bring clearer understanding to followers or tribe members or themselves. In any case, the motivation back of the transformation was what turned the art from useful shamanistic ritual into a depraved horror. The disease known as lycanthropy sometimes causes werewolf-like tendencies, and Albano de Jesus was a northern Portugal resident who had this werewolf disease for many years. And when he had his fits, he'd sometimes attack animals and perform superhuman feats of strength without remembering them later. And in a fit, he could walk and jump gigantic distances, like he could jump 30 feet in the air, defy gravity, walk on fire, swim like a fish. And on his death in 1976, his body decomposed in a single day, and strange, foul-smelling liquid poured from the cracks in his coffin. Witnesses of media in Portugal are the only too happy to recount the performances and experiences to researchers going in and researching this. So this is Al Fry, ending this little presentation, and we hope you'll stay in touch. This incredible inquiry series of ours, and enjoy your time here, because this is one of the most unusual planets in this section of the universe. Bye-bye now. Well, evidently, in the African nation, the gigantic water monsters aren't the only unusual prehistoric monsters that are living there. And in Upper Kenya, even the bravest Maasai warriors will not venture into one area where the Nandi bears live. Explorers looking for them have come up missing. They are said to be huge and have a head somewhat like a lion, and they jump on victims from trees. Very little evidence, of course, is available to show that this is a reality. What we do have a little more proof of are the mammoths and mastodons in our recent past. And it's assumed that most of our ancestors had to deal with these mammoths and mastodons, and even Indians in Canada say their recent ancestors built houses on stilts in the northern lakes there to escape these great beasts with tusks that roamed through that part of the country. And Indians in our eastern United States say they built stockades for similar reasons. And all this is in their traditions and legends. The same story, of course, is written on the cave walls all over the planet. And Picture Rock in Pennsylvania in 1872 shows a fight between a mammoth and Indians. And this Lenape stone shows wigwams and warriors and other cave writings found across the globe show mammoths and prove the point. According to an 1873 zoologist journal, a New York reporter interviewed a Russian who had seen 5 mammoths in a remote valley at the headwaters of the Lena River. Now, none were young, and he assumed that the tiny group may die off without replacement stock. Now, in the same year of 1873, the Scientific American told of Russian colonists who found 3 living mastodons in northern Siberia. Now, a few earlier in 1827, John Rankin wrote of mastodons still living down in South America in the Andes. We all hear of the trapper legends in the northern part of Canada, of course, telling of these signs in an earlier era. Hello, this is the first in a series of strange creature presentations. And I'm Al Fry, and in the next couple of hours, we're going to explore some of the larger life forms that are still considered monsters and legends on this unique planet of ours. Now, please bear with us if the quality of illustrations isn't high enough for great detail. It's just a subject that doesn't get enough exposure for visual documentation. Now, the scientific community will often scoff at the idea of these creatures being in existence yet. But Mother Nature has billions of eggs of strange life forms scattered over Mother Earth and her skin. And when the right conditions come along, the right eggs will hatch out a suitable life form. Now, in 1900, an amateur scientist named Andrew Cross startled the scientific world by announcing he had produced life from rocks by electrifying porous stone and submerging it in sulfuric acid and silicitate of potash solutions. A small insect was formed in the rock. Now, scientists of then and now scoffed at the experiments, even though others got the same results through the same actions. So what Cross had actually done then was to hatch out minute insect eggs, which were supported in the rock. And our Earth supports uncountable forms of life hidden away in such eggs that are only hatched when suitable conditions arise. Now, just as humankind was made up of all sizes of our species in the past, so too animals often had extreme size differences at various times in the past, and many small skeletons of strange small creatures are frequently dug up or seen in the records of rock impressions. Well, as the climate and nature of Earth changed drastically some 13,000 years ago, what remained of the extremely... Many of these early North American trappers and such cut steaks from frozen mastodons and mammoths and ate them from the frozen creatures that were frozen for goodness knows how long in the ice there. The Indian traditions in the same area tell of caribou and elk that were once gigantic, but evidence is lacking in this. There have been no frozen carcasses to prove the theory, and they may have referred to the mastodons. Well, what we do know is that both mammoths and elephants, the ancient varieties, are described in various North American Indian legends and the legends of people all over the planet in the northern areas. And some of the scientific monthlies, for instance, cover such stories and legends and sightings, actually. 1952 Scientific Monthly is a good example. Considerable evidence points to the fact that while these great beasts were roaming the face of the planet, our relatives and forebears were right there among them. And what about the sea monsters of the world? Whole books could be written on the subject. Hundreds of sightings and ship logs all across the globe. Hundreds of years now. Even in today's tabloid newsstand magazines and tabloids, there are still cases of sea monsters being sighted. Now, a recent example was the 4,000-pound carcass that a Japanese found off the coast of New Zealand. Well, this fisherman named Maru photographed and took samples of this monster in 1977. And tests showed that the animal was not a mammal. Well, even when such monsters wash up on shore or get caught dead in nets, the majority of scientists still scoff at the evidence. And they think up their alternative scenarios. Such monsters are supposed to be extinct, and they're extinct in the textbooks, and so they're extinct. Here's a 1951 photograph of the Henday carcass. The large and small monsters of the earth died out for the most part. The spirit matter or antimatter part of these animals had to come back into smaller present species that we recognize today. The giant reptile families of yesterday, or today then the small lizards and such that we see scattered across the globe. And further details of why the climate suddenly changed on this earth is covered elsewhere. In 1922 Scientific American, it mentions a report of many of these mammoth reptiles still being seen down in South America in the plateau regions, which we see here. Now, even the Indians in our own country tell about their forefathers who built stockades to keep these giant beasts like this at bay. Now, we all know that there were many different varieties of interesting dinosaurs on the planet millions of years ago. A few people realize that many different varieties have been reported in recent years. And, for instance, dinosaurs have been reported in Africa for at least 2 centuries. Now, in 1776, there were reports of an expedition in Africa which told of these huge vegetation gobblers, and the stories have never ceased since then. In the early 80s, for example, a couple of United States expeditions went looking for the beasts, and one actually saw the animals. Now, some of these prehistoric animals, like the Brontosaurus and Stegosaurus, shown here, were huge. North of the Great Pyramid, an ancient day and night boat used by the pharaohs in ceremonial rites was found, and actually the head of a gigantic animal with huge teeth, even larger than these prehistoric animals shown here. Now, there was a mummy of this particular species of duck-billed dinosaur that was found in Wyoming some years ago. It was acquired by the American Museum of New York. And this, of course, proved that this species was millions of years past the extinction date set by experts. Now, there are isolated incidents of creatures like this being with us today. And explorer-writer Harold Wilkins tells of a French traveler and a priest in the Yukon Territory who saw an Arctic dinosaur in 1905. It was roughly 100 miles east of Dawson. They saw giant tracks, and within a day of pursuing their quarry, they saw it. It was 50 foot long, and was thought to weigh about 50 tons. And unlike its southern brethren, it had stiff, bristly hair and a horn protruding from its head. And 5 years later, the same media told of another sighting of the beast on Partridge Creek near Dawson. Now, water monsters up to 100 feet have long been described by natives around the headwaters of the Nile in country like this. Well, there are several African lakes that have huge lake monsters which have been seen by numerous natives and explorers. And these Congo monsters, which are called Mokele Mobembe by the natives, have been seen from the 18th century and are still sighted today. Now, unlike the aggressive meat hunters, which we have an example here, these shy African vegetation eaters have snake-like heads and long tails and can reach up to 50 feet. They're similar to dinosaurs. The dinosaurs that we see illustrations of so often. Now, according to German press reports, the photos they showed of a swamp monster in the Congo was taken by a Swedish rubber plantation overseer in the area of Kasai. He'd seen a strange beast with a reptile head and tail while in the swamps and snapped its picture. The zoologists of the time were skeptical of the claims, of course. Well, in 1983, one skeptic was the head zoologist of the Congo, and he decided after 2 centuries of rumors to investigate the river monsters of the Congo himself. And imagine his surprise when he located one in the Lake Tell region. It was unfortunately in deep water. It didn't cooperate by coming ashore and having its picture taken, but it was seen in the deeper water, and this was in Fate magazine of 1281. In the 70s, of course, the movies got in on the act and showed classic examples of the great reptiles fighting among each other. And this is an example of the animator's art here.